Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to call our meeting here of the Standing Committee of Justice and Human Rights to order. It's our third meeting of the day, meeting number 34, and it is televised. And according to orders of reference, on Monday, June 16, 2014, Bill C-36, an act to amend the Criminal Code in response to the Supreme Court of Canada decision in Attorney General of Canada versus Bedford, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. We have a number of witnesses here with us today, and I am going to introduce all the witnesses, and then we will go to 10 minutes each organization, and then there will be rounds of questions afterwards. From the Government of Manitoba, we have the Honourable Andrew Swan, Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Thank you for joining us, Minister. From the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, we have Julie Beasley. Where's Julie? There she is. There's Julie. We have, and I'm going to try this, Concentration de lutte contre exploitation sexuelle. Close enough. That's for an English guy, not too bad, I guess. We have Diane Matt and Rose Sullivan are here with us. The Sex Trafficking Survivors Unit is with Natasha Fall, is here. And Maggie's, the Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. Jean McDonald and Monica Foster are here. Forrester, sorry. That's right. Monica Forrester. We're going to start as the witnesses are here. Minister Swan, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I am thankful to have the opportunity to be here to speak to the committee about Bill C-36. Finding the right way to reduce sexual exploitation in Canada is difficult, complex, and controversial. It's also vitally important. Bill C-36 deals with the legal gap resulting from the Supreme Court of Canada decision in the case of Bedford. We now have an opportunity together to find a better way to protect and assist victims of sexual exploitation and enhance safety in our communities. In my time today, I'll explain why Manitoba supports the adoption of the so-called Nordic model. I will also suggest why and how Bill C-36 needs to be amended. I'll also talk about the necessary support for victims of sexual exploitation and why we need clarity respecting the funding which was announced by the federal government for this purpose. In Manitoba's view, prostitution is not a victimless crime. Everyday vulnerable persons, women, men, and children are preyed upon by individuals and groups who sexually exploit them. The harm caused to those exploited persons is severe. Alcohol and drug addiction, violent victimization, and emotional traumatization at the hands of buyers of sex, pimps, drug dealers, and others. We know that many victims in Manitoba are first sexually exploited at a very, very young age. The majority of those who escape suffer from deep physical and emotional scars and trauma that remain with them for the rest of their lives. Victims of sexual exploitation in Manitoba and elsewhere face risks and dangers that can only be considered extreme. In its Homicide in Canada report in 2011, the Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics indicated that between 1997 and 2011, 99 people were killed as a direct result of being sexually exploited. It is likely, Mr. Chair, that that number is actually quite lower than the reality. This number only includes those cases in which the police are able to determine that the death occurred during prostitution-related activities. Indeed, many missing and murdered women cases, such as the Picton case in BC or the recent Lamb case in Manitoba, involve women who were thought to have been sexually exploited. The Manitoba government does not support the legalization of prostitution. It does not support the full decriminalization of prostitution or a de facto decriminalization of prostitution, which would occur if there was no response to the Bedford decision. All of those options would continue to allow the purchase of others for sex, devalue human life, and enable tragedies associated with prostitution to continue to occur. The great majority of sellers of sex, not all, but the great majority, are indeed victims of sexual exploitation. The great majority of sellers of sex do not have any meaningful choice about becoming involved and staying involved in prostitution. Given the significant role in prostitution of childhood sexual abuse, substance abuse, financial dependency, chemical dependency, and coercion by street gangs and organized crime, it is unreasonable to expect that the victims of sexual exploitation can easily exit without appropriate laws and supports to assist them. Bill C-36 offers an appropriate approach to address prostitution that focuses for the first time in Canada's history on reducing the demand for the purchase of sex and assisting victims to escape sexual exploitation. With reduced demand, there will be less incentive to coerce others to engage in prostitution and human trafficking. The Nordic model of prostitution laws flows from the premise that victims of sexual exploitation should not be further victimized by criminal charges for selling their sexual services. Instead, the laws take on the demand side of prostitution by making it a criminal offense to purchase sex, and by penalizing those who exploit the victims for profit by making it a criminal offense to profit from procuring sexual services for another person. In the Nordic model, the criminal law is part of a larger strategy that includes increasing public awareness of the harms of prostitution and providing exit strategies and supports to assist victims of sexual exploitation. The Nordic model has been successful in reducing prostitution where it has been adopted. For example, it significantly decreased street prostitution by at least half in Sweden at a time when prostitution in other Nordic countries was increasing. Human trafficking to Sweden has all but ceased. Studies from Norway next door show a marked decrease in serious violence against victims of sexual exploitation. Several other countries, including Norway, Finland, Iceland, Israel, and France, have since also adopted or are in the process of adopting the Nordic model. In Manitoba, I can tell you that prosecutors and police have effectively adopted a Nordic model demand reduction approach in dealing with prostitution charges under the criminal code. Our prosecutors encourage those who are charged with offenses to participate in diversion programs and consider whether more stringent probation conditions, such as community work and stay-away orders, should be sought against buyers of sex convicted under the criminal code prostitution provisions. In November 2013, the Winnipeg Police Service announced that its counter-exploitation unit would be adopting the approach of not arresting those victims of sexual exploitation, but instead working with them to see if they could connect them with social work organizations and support groups that could help them leave what they're doing. They would also continue to arrest and charge Johns and those who exploit the sexually exploited people for profit. The RCMP and other municipal police forces in Manitoba have also taken this differential approach. Given my government's support for the Nordic model, expressed at the last national meeting of Justice Ministers and by way of my letter to Minister McKay of February 5, I'm very pleased to see that Bill C-36 primarily adopts a similar approach in terms of creating an offense of purchasing sexual services and criminalizing profiting from the prostitution of others, while not criminalizing selling one's own sexual services or using the proceeds for non-exploitive purposes. I do support these elements of the bill, and I encourage all members of Parliament to enact them so they can be implemented as soon as possible. I am pleased I don't stand alone. I do want to recognize the work and the efforts of Manitoba MP Joyce Smith. We've maybe taken a different path to the same conclusion. I'm sure some other day we'll be disagreeing vehemently on something, but Joyce Smith has been a strong voice on this in Manitoba. Now, that being said, there are certainly requirements that are amended before this bill should pass. I do have serious concerns about those provisions of Bill C-36 that would criminalize the victims of sexual exploitation if they are forced to engage in prostitution in a manner that stops or impedes traffic or communicate for the purposes of prostitution in a public place where persons under the age of 18 may reasonably be expected to be present. These provisions are completely inconsistent with the Nordic model in terms of punishing and re-victimizing the victims of sexual exploitation. This would force those engaged in street prostitution to ply their trade in more isolated and dangerous locations, would put their safety at risk, and certainly could jeopardize the constitutionality of the legislation by undermining the safety of victims of sexual exploitation rather than enhancing their protection. I can't support those provisions, and I would urge that Bill C-36 be amended to remove them from the legislation. I do have serious concerns that these provisions contained in Clause 15 of the bill would lead to greater danger, an almost certain series of court challenges, and a much enhanced risk they will ultimately be struck down. In the meantime, the focus will continue to be on the sellers of sex. Instead, it should be on the buyers of sex to take responsibility for their actions and change their behavior. I've tried to determine how these provisions made it into the bill. My best guess is the attempt to reconcile a lack of consensus among law enforcement as the best way to have victims of sexual exploitation make changes in their life. Perhaps the threat of criminal prosecution is seen by some to be the best way to get there. I do not agree. In Manitoba, as I've already stated, our law enforcement partners have already moved as far as they can toward the Nordic model. The prostitution diversion program operated by the Salvation Army and paid for by the diversion program for the buyers of sex, commonly known as John's School, will continue and hopefully be enhanced. Victims of sexual exploitation will pursue change if we give them reasons and the opportunity to do so, not by holding the threat of prosecution over their heads. Finally, although not part of Bill C-36, I would like to express qualified support for the federal government's commitment to provide funding for programs to assist the victims of sexual exploitation. Programs to assist victims to withdraw from prostitution and pursue more positive alternatives are an essential part of the Nordic model and a key element to the success of that approach. There is a need for robust, ongoing programming to provide sexually exploited victims with a meaningful choice to leave the sex trade. It is unclear from the federal government's announcement whether the $20 million funding allocated is a one-time grant or intended to reflect a commitment to annual federal funding for this purpose. I saw media reports just today that suggested it would be $4 million for each of 5 years. If we divide that up per capita, that would mean less than $200,000 a year for Manitoba. We already spend $8 million a year as a province helping out victims of sexual exploitation. I hope the government will reconsider this and provide ongoing funding, because the needs of sexually exploited victims will be ongoing, no matter how well this bill works. I would urge the Minister of Justice to consult provincial and territorial ministers to assess the level and type of federal funding that is critical to support long-term programming to assist sexually exploited victims across the country. The appendix to the written submission, Mr. Chair, describes Tracia's Trust, which is Manitoba's strategy to assist victims of sexual exploitation. Again, Manitoba invests about $8 million per year. We look forward to meaningful, ongoing contributions from the federal government, and I do promise that Manitoba will invest those contributions wisely. In closing, I want to thank the committee for allowing me the opportunity to provide my comments on behalf of the people of Manitoba. I do urge the passage of Bill C-36, but with these important changes so that we can change the dialogue and change the channel in this country and go after demand. I do look forward to any questions you may have after the other presenters have had their opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for that presentation from the Government of Manitoba. Now from the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, Ms. Beasley.
Thank you. The Evangelical Fellowship of Canada is the National Association of Evangelical Christians gathered together for influence, impact, and identity in ministry and public witness. Since 1964, the EFC has provided a national forum for evangelicals and a constructive voice for biblical principles in life and society. And over the last 2 decades, the EFC has presented a number of papers and submissions to Parliament on the issue of prostitution and on the closely related issue of human trafficking. We also intervened before the Supreme Court of Canada in the Bedford case. So we're grateful for the opportunity to speak to this important bill. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on a few key elements of the bill and ask that you would refer to our written brief for our fuller analysis. A central message of the Bible is the call for God's people to be compassionate because God has been compassionate to us. Our belief that God has created all people in His image and loves each one compels us both to announce and to guard the fundamental dignity of each person. So we understand that people should be treated as creatures with inherent worth, not as objects for another's gratification or profit. The EFC has long expressed concern for those who are prostituted based on biblical principles that compel care for the vulnerable, the pursuit of justice, and inform the duty of care we owe one another as human beings. Research shows that the vast majority of individuals in prostitution enter by force, coercion, or as a result of constrained choice and last resort. Prostitution is inherently dangerous. It's violence against women and a form of systemic exploitation of many of our society's most vulnerable women, children, and men. We do not believe that prostitution can be considered safe or legitimated as a form of work, nor can it be accepted as a solution to poverty and a range of other underlying social issues. We commend the government for the good work it has done in crafting Bill C-36, which courageously challenges the assumption that men are entitled to paid sexual access to women's bodies, and boldly refutes the notion that buying sex is an inevitable in our society. In this regard, the bill represents a paradigm shift in law and policy, and eventually, we hope, in public attitude about prostitution. This is a shift the EFC has advocated for, so we're pleased to see it reflected not just in the bill, but in comments and speeches delivered by the minister in introducing and framing it. The preamble begins with the recognition that prostitution is inherently exploitive and dangerous, that objectification of the human body and commodification of sexual activity causes social harm, and that prostitution violates human dignity and gender equality. It also recognizes that issues like poverty, addiction, mental illness, and racialization are key contributing factors to individuals entering prostitution. And it notes the importance of denouncing and prohibiting the purchase of sex because that's what creates the demand for prostitution. This positioning effectively turns the historic treatment of prostitution on its head. Legal and political treatment of prostitution has long focused almost exclusively on those who are prostituted and how we might deal with them as public nuisance, as a threat to public health, or a source of community disruption. sex buyers who drive the demand that funnels individuals into prostitution and holds them there have been largely invisible. C36 correctly identifies and targets demand as the driving force behind prostitution and trafficking for sexual exploitation. The bill proposes a new offense prohibiting the purchase or attempted purchase of sexual services. If passed, the purchase of sex would be illegal for the first time in Canada, and a buyer's conduct would be illegal wherever it occurs. The sex trade operates according to market principles of supply and demand. Without male demand for paid sexual access to primarily women and children, the prostitution industry wouldn't flourish or expand. This new offense takes aim at the root of this exploitation and is supported by significant fines and potential jail time. Surveys of men who buy sex indicate that these, along with a risk of public shaming, are the things that would most effectively deter them from continuing in their sex buying behavior. We recommend that funds incurred from fines under Section 286.11 be directed towards exit services. We question the purpose of Section 286.11b, which gives the option of a summary offense with lower fines and jail terms. For consistency of message and deterrence, our preference would be that all offenses under this section be indictable as under 286.11a. However, if there's good reason for maintaining the option of a summary conviction at the Crown's discretion, then we suggest that summary conviction only be an option on first offense and that subsequent offenses be indictable. We also question what will become of re-educational programs like John Schools, which serve an important restorative justice function. Feedback from buyers who attend and anecdotal evidence from those who run or participate in the programs suggests they play an important role in changing how buyers view prostitution, and that recidivism rates among those who attend are relatively low. In prostitution, everyone is robbed, including the buyer and certainly any family they may have. So our interest is that all parties to prostitution be restored, and we feel that John Schools play an important role in this. So we hope provinces will be encouraged to maintain or establish prostitution offender programs as part of the punishment for offenses under Section 286.1. Where the diversion program is often an alternative to a first offense criminal charge, it could be made mandatory, so that in addition to the $1,000 fine on first offense, buyers could be required to attend a diversion program. Bill C-36 also initiates a critical shift in how those who are prostituted are viewed in law. Research and anecdotal evidence tells us that between 88 and 96% of those in prostitution are not there by choice and say they would get out if they felt they had a viable alternative. This bill recognizes and reflects that reality. The government has made it clear that in the spirit and intent of the legislation, those who are prostituted are no longer seen as nuisance, but as vulnerable, and therefore afforded immunity from criminal charges except under specific circumstances. This is an important shift that we affirm wholeheartedly. We are concerned, though, that Sections 213.1a and b, which deal with stopping motor vehicles or impeding vehicular or pedestrian traffic, remain and are unqualified by the new Section 213.11, which makes it an offense to communicate for prostitution in a public place that is or is next to a place where reasonable minors might be expected to be present. We understand the balance the government has tried to achieve between protecting vulnerable individuals involved in prostitution and protecting communities, especially children, from exposure. Where there is prostitution, there are Johns and pimps, and the objective of protecting children from exposure, being solicited by buyers or approached by pimps, is a good one. But the current wording of the section leaves a fairly big loophole that could undermine the intent of the law to criminalize mainly the activities of Johns and pimps. Further, by our interpretation, the only ones who risk criminalization under the proposed laws are the most vulnerable, those engaging in street-level prostitution who are among the poorest, most desperate, most addicted. Criminalizing vulnerable individuals creates barriers to their exit from prostitution and further entrenches the inequality and marginalization that got them there. Criminal records are a significant barrier to many potential educational or employment opportunities for those who successfully exit, especially when so many who find health and freedom want to then go back and help. We want to minimize the potential of this section for criminalizing prostituted individuals. The current scope is far too broad, as it could be argued that minors could be reasonably expected to be just about anywhere in public. Our preference is that Section 213 be either narrowed significantly or removed. Offenses under Section 213.1 and 1.1 are punishable on summary conviction, which, as I understand it, can carry fines of up to $2,000, jail time up to 6 months, or both. If Section 213 is not amended to minimize the potential for criminalization, we suggest the punishment for these summary offenses be set at a very low threshold with no potential for imprisonment and defined in the legislation so that we can ensure the most vulnerable don't continue to face undue hardship. Ultimately, a lot of this comes down to enforcement. How can we be assured that the spirit and intent of the bill will be upheld when it comes to enforcing the laws? We've traveled extensively across Canada conducting public informational forums on prostitution in partnership with Defend Dignity, and I can say two things with confidence. There are police officers and police forces in whose hands we feel completely confident that the spirit of this law will be upheld. But there are also others in whose hands we don't have that same confidence. The Attorney General of Canada can give direction to the provincial attorneys general, who then give guidance to law enforcement within their jurisdiction. But how a particular police department enforces the laws is determined by the department itself, as evidenced by the number of police forces across the country who've already been policing in a manner consistent with Bill C-36. So we suggest that standardized training be developed for law enforcement, provincial attorneys general, and Crown attorneys about the new treatment of prostitution under C-36 to support enforcement that's consistent with the intent of the legislation. Finally, the legislative changes proposed are part of what is to be a two-pronged approach taken by the government. We welcome the initial commitment of $20 million to supporting exit programs and hope this will translate to long-term sustained federal funding. The government should also engage provincial, territorial, and municipal governments and a wide range of stakeholders in developing a comprehensive national plan to ensure the programs and supports are in place to prevent vulnerable individuals from entering prostitution and support those who are in as the exit. We suggest such a plan could be integrated into the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking. It's also important to address poverty and affordable housing as underlying social issues that drive individuals to prostitution or make them vulnerable to exploitation, because preventing entry into prostitution is just as important as helping them exit once they're in. Thank you.
Our next presenter is from the Concentration de lutte contre l'exploitation sexuelle. Madame Matt, are you the speaker?
Oui. Merci au comité d'avoir accepté.
Thank you very much to the committee for hearing us and for hearing the women that we represent. Uniting the fight against sexual exploitation can only salute the decision to criminalize the purchasing of sex in Canada. Even though the bill is imperfect, we regard this as a victory for abolition. The bill calls upon Canadian society to stop considering prostitution and the industry that exploits it as inevitable and a victimless crime. This is not inevitable. This is not a victimless crime. For the first time in Canadian legal history, a government is inviting us to examine prostitution as a crime against the person, a form of violence against women that is incompatible with the quest for social equality, in particular, the equality rights of women who are among the most marginalized. Our organization has been in existence for nearly 10 years, and we are in daily contact with women who have been or are in prostitution. We believe in the necessity of building a world without prostitution. We offer support, guidance, and an ear to female victims of sexual exploitation. We fight with them for recognition of their rights and to ensure their security, including the security of not being prostituted and of receiving support to leave the business when they want to. We organize the women so they can act to bring about the change they want in their lives and those of the women around them. We do preventive work to combat the trivialization of prostitution and to publicize its impact on the physical and mental health of those who are dealing with this reality, but also on access to equality for all women. We consider ourselves part of an international movement that is working tirelessly to denounce the secular tradition of prostitution. In this brief, I can't go into the details, of course, but we invite you to look at Bill C-36 from a perspective that sees government action as part of the struggle against the commodification of human beings in the interest of equality for all. We shall focus first of all on the concept of security and the need for an interpretation of that concept that is as broad as possible, so that our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I would invite you to not look at this issue too narrowly. The Bedford decision talked about privatizing the security of women in prostitution. We suggest that women should hire a driver, a protector, rather than deal with the origin of women's insecurity in prostitution. For us, that is unacceptable in Canadian society, that we reduce the notion of security to its most simplistic expression. We also invite you to refuse, as others have before us, all forms of criminalization of people who are prostitutes. My colleague can speak to that topic. The word of women, because what they have to say is very real, especially when women in prostitution criticize prostitution. Those who work against prostitution, all of them manage to invalidate what they have to say. I invite you to listen to what women in prostitution have to say. Our organization has conducted research that we can make available to you in the last year. We spoke to women in 6 cities in Quebec, and 45% of them were still working in the sex industry at the time that they participated in the interviews or responded to the survey. Among that 45% that was still active, 80% of them wanted to leave prostitution, but they did not know a single organization that could help them to do that.
I think it's very important to take those voices into account. Now, clearly, the violence we're talking about today, and in terms of the women that I've been speaking to, 90% of the women who responded were victims of violence from men within their immediate environment, whether that be men in their family, whether it be clients, whether it be pimps. So 90% of these women were the victims of violence. The women we speak to on a daily basis, as well as those who were involved in our research, need more justice. They need more consistency and more services and the acknowledgement of the situation that they are dealing with, the violence that they are experiencing. This violence is still taboo in 2014. Now, even though we support Bill C-36, one fundamental change must be made to act upon the undertaking to decriminalize the victims of sexual exploitation. The Nordic model, Swedish model, regardless, is made up of 3 inextricably linked points. First, completely decriminalizing prostituted women. Second, criminalizing the purchase of sexual services. And third, education. So the mentality has to be changed. The perception of prostitution has to be changed within our society. And so Bill C-36, if it is going to be successful, has to take those 3 elements into account. And I would just wrap up by saying that we're now at a crossroads and choices have to be made. No political party should attempt to avoid the most important question, and that is whether or not prostitution and sexual exploitation should even exist within our society. If the answer is no, then we need to act, and we need to go much further than Bill C-36. There has to be more available for women than prostitution. We have to want more for them. Obviously, we support the $20 million. It's not enough. There should be more. But that money should be provided to groups who are working consistently with the preamble of this bill. That is to say, to stop seeing this as inevitable, to stop seeing prostitution as inevitable. In Canada, there are organizations receiving funding from governments and foundations and who are still maintaining women in prostitution. So they're saying things like, if you don't like it in this area, you could go to that area, or rather than use a pimp, you could do this individually. But I think we have to call a spade a spade. There are groups who are keeping women in prostitution, and Bill C-36 is calling upon us to change that kind of industry and stop making it a legitimate industry. This is an illegitimate industry, and it is inconsistent with equality between men and women. Thank you. Rose. My name is Rose, and I'm a survivor of prostitution. I'm an advocate within our organization, and I'm involved in a help group for women who want an exit from prostitution. I was involved in prostitution for 3 long years, and during those 3 long years, I tried to make prostitution safer for myself. I wanted to be alive. I had children to support. And what I learned during my time involved in prostitution is that it is impossible to be involved in a safe way. I started as someone who was for sex work, and I ended up as someone who advocates for abolition. I am now advocating for prostitution to be abolished. And that's why I absolutely support Bill C-36. I would, however, like to say that there are parts that criminalize women, and I am troubled by that. I think that it is absolutely essential to not criminalize women prostitutes in order to be able to ensure their safety, and their exit from prostitution has to be supported. Even criminalizing it just a little makes, I think, the rest of the work useless, because pimps and various industries that profit by prostitution will once again have the tools in their hands to be able to manipulate women, to blackmail women, and to maintain them in prostitution. If they have any sort of way, if there's any way of criminalizing women, then people will benefit by that. So I think there should be no criminalization whatsoever of women. I also don't think it makes sense to say that you can be a victim in certain situations and a criminal in other situations. I think also that that aspect of the bill could increase prostitution in areas where there are children, even though the attempt of the bill is to avoid that, because pimps are going to find any way possible to maintain their power over women, regardless of where they go. And so pimping women may be illegal, but they will find a way of taking advantage of this and making sure that women are in a criminal situation, for instance, being in these areas where they shouldn't be, near, for example, children, churches, etc. I also would like to say that based on my experience as a mother of 3 children, I feel that women who engage in prostitution in their homes when their children are perhaps in nearby bedrooms or in a nearby apartment are those women who probably have the least possible choice, and therefore they are the most vulnerable. And criminalizing those women more than those, for example, who have the opportunity to work under other circumstances is not the right way to help them. Everywhere there are ways of punishing women. This is an arbitrary way of punishing women, and I think that municipalities, anyone will be able to take advantage of women. People will be able to take advantage of women by using this criminalization as a tool. Now, my greatest fear when I was involved in prostitution was to lose custody of my children and to have a criminal record. And that's what my pimps used against me. That's how they blackmailed me. That's how they kept me in prostitution for a much longer time than I wanted to be involved in it. There was one client who became quite violent with me. I wanted to stop seeing him. And one of the arguments that was used was that they would call the police force, that they would involve custody of my children, and I was afraid. One day I did dare go to the police, and because of the vague legislation, I couldn't really get any service from them. The police did not know how to assist me, even though they knew I needed help. So I think that there should be no gray areas in the legislation. Anything that is legislated with respect to prostitution has to be absolutely clear and absolutely straightforward to enforce in order to be able to help those women who want to exit prostitution to do so. Thank you.
Our next presenter is from the Sex Trafficking Survivors Unit, Ms. Fall.
Sex Trafficking Survivors United is a survivor-led international organization. Our 177 survivors urge Canadian Parliament to take a stand against the exploitation of young, poor, and vulnerable by the richer, older, and more powerful. Pass Bill C-36. As all survivors know, the vast majority of people end up in prostitution because they have no other choice. Only serves to stigmatize and further trap most of the sexually exploited. This empowers their traffickers and abusers while erasing the truth that the exploited are victims of multiple crimes. This is a statement made by our founder, Stella Maher. According to the Toronto Sex Crimes Unit, the average age is 14. My story, my truth, is a common story. I entered when I was close to 15 years old. I came from a middle-class home in the Calgary suburbs. My father, a police officer, my mother managed bridal shops. My seemingly normal life suddenly became unsafe, and I hit the streets. Not knowing where to turn for help, I spent months couch surfing from place to place, often hungry and scared. I began having sex at an early age, often giving myself away loosely for a place to stay. I was first introduced to prostitution by underage girls, 14 and 15 years old, and eventually a man who posed as a manager and offered me a business opportunity. I introduced my 5 underage friends into prostitution at that time. We sold sex independently for a number of months. We fought society's stereotypes that we were junkies, criminals, and sexual deviants. We tried hard not to feed those stereotypes by not using hard drugs or having pimps. But one by one, each one of us ended up with a pimp and or on drugs. My best friend was murdered. She was shot in the head by a pimp she only knew for 3 months, who posed as a bodyguard. We easily gained work while underage in escort agencies, ads in papers, street corners, massage parlors. And while the geographical location in which sex is sold varies, what remains the same is the men who purchase human bodies. The power dynamics do not change. This is a business exchange based on lies and gender inequality and threats of violence. It is often referred to as the game because both parties struggle for power and control. The prostituted people need to feel they have power in the situation for their survival, the sex buyers for their own personal gratification. Most violence we experienced in prostitution happened after the sex act was finished. Men spent their welfare check or their mortgage payments to have sex with me. They used money set aside for their child's birthday gift or anniversary gifts. When I was no longer a fantasy image to them and the thrill was over, I was just a regular person, and in some cases considered disposable to these men. I met and I was sold with hundreds of underage girls in prostitution. I have counseled over 1,200 prostituted women, trans, and children. Most disclose entering as children. Child sex abuse is when an adult or an older child persuades, tricks, or forces a child into sexual activity. It includes sexual acts, inappropriate touching, showing the child pornography, or involving them in prostitution via act of government. So it's considered child abuse when an adult has sex with a child or youth. When a child receives money for sex, it does not change anything. It is still abuse. Let's talk about the slippery slope of legalized prostitution and at-risk youth. In 2011, Youthline website promoted a youth sex worker workshop facilitated by a pro-prostitution group that you will soon hear from, entitled Hustle and Dough, Youth Sex Workers Build Power and Safety. Hustle spelt with a $. This is a group for underage and ages 24 to 16. Topics that were discussed were how to be in control while working. Children have little or no control in situations of abuse with adults. Another topic was how to support yourself financially, physically, and emotionally. Teaching kids how to be sex workers is abuse. How to avoid arrest. So teaching youth how to avoid police. How to avoid HIV. I can't tell you how many times I've had a condom pulled off by a John without me knowing, or a hole poked in it, or offered $20 or $1,000 for a condomless blowjob. This workshop was facilitated by a current sex worker who began as a youth herself. I have copies of it which I've submitted to the chair. It is a basic human right for women and children to be free from being sold to men. No child or woman should have to resort to accepting violence for their survival under any circumstance. It is crucial to note that all but one of the experiential affiants in this Bedford case entered prostitution as children. The other affiant admitted to being coerced. Considering most prostituted women and men entered as children, it's fair to assume many have not had a healthy comparison apart from prostitution, which is why it does not surprise people such as myself with lived experience that on July of 2012, the Adult Entertainment Association of Canada threatened to recruit high school students claiming to help youth pay for university. But in reality, they are advocating for an industry that thrives off the male demand for younger flesh for their own personal gain. Someone who greatly inspired me to be where I am today, a graduate of college and university, a college professor of police foundations for 5 years, the founder of an organization, and a board member of Sex Trafficking Survivors United, once said to me in my earlier years when I first transited from the sex trade. And I'd been out a couple of years and I really struggled. I blamed myself for a lot of the experiences that I had endured. She said to me, for something to be a real choice, you need to have another option of equal or greater value. There's no job description that could accurately portray my experiences in prostitution. I have sold sex independently, and I have been forced by so-called bodyguards. My pimp was shot while protecting me from another pimp. He also stabbed another man 7 times who harmed me. He hung this over my head, making me believe I owed him my life for this protection. My pimp burned me with cigarettes, broke my bones, and brutally beat me on a regular basis. I was trained not to call the police. I listened out of fear of losing work, the only work that I knew. It was not the laws that hindered me from calling the police. It was the pimps and the body house owners that did not want the police attention to their establishments due to chasing the sex buyers away. We were labeled rotten snitches when we went to the police. Therefore, we dealt with violent matters internally. A prostituted woman was killed in Germany in a brothel this month, and it was the 22nd murder since the complete legalization of prostitution in 2002. Whereas in Sweden, where the Nordic model passed in 1999, the only murder of a prostituted woman was in 2013, and it is not clear whether or not it was prostitution related. Sex Trafficking Survivors United recommends that the government raise the $20 million allocated to help survivor-led organizations such as ourselves help the people, our sisters, exit from this dangerous, dark, lucrative, underground industry. We recommend that Section 213 be revisited and all criminalization of prostituted people be removed. Women who are unable to adequately protect themselves or their own children are not in a position to be able to protect children in the communities. I have provided more details in our brief submitted in partnership with the London Abused Women's Centre, which you'll hear from the director there on another day. And I'd like to give thanks on behalf of all survivors around the world who are in support of this bill. We recognize the historic significance of the government in recognizing this form of male violence against prostituted people. It is clear from the evidence I have presented today that the government is on the right track to protect our most vulnerable in society, and for that, survivors around the world are most grateful. I would like to personally extend my deepest gratitude to MP Joyce Smith and Minister Peter MacKay, for listening to survivors. There's a reason why so many of us are exposing prostitution. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Our next and final presenter for this panel is Maggie's, the Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. The floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Hi there, my name is Jean McDonald. I'm the Executive Director of Maggie's. Maggie's, the Toronto Sex Workers Action Project, is an organization that's run for and by sex workers, the oldest of its kind in Canada. Our mission is to assist sex workers in their efforts to live and work with safety and dignity. Maggie's is a harm reduction agency primarily funded through the Ontario Ministry of Health. We provide safer sex and safer drug use supplies, education, and support, and have had several thousand client contacts in the last year. We do frontline work, and our service users are predominantly street-based sex workers. Many are lower income, Indigenous, of color, and/or transgendered. Since the legislation was introduced, we've held many consultations with our service users who unanimously reject this bill. They believe it will not ensure their safety or their security. Instead, they say it will push them further into harm's way, continuing the epidemic of violence against sex workers in Canada. They are gravely worried about their own safety and worry that more of their friends will go missing, be assaulted, raped, or murdered. Recreating the same harms of the old legislation struck down by the Supreme Court, Bill C-36 will continue to allow violent predators like Robert Pickton to prey on sex workers who have been pushed into less public areas of the city, unable to screen their potential clients, and unable to work together. This is why many people have taken to calling Bill C-36 the Pickton model. The debate here should not be about choice or about whether violence happens to sex workers. We know violence happens to sex workers. We want to address that violence. Instead, it should be about the best ways to ensure safety and security and access to services, such as police if necessary, for sex workers. Bill C-36 does not do this. It both indirectly and directly punishes sex workers by making prostitution illegal, as Peter MacKay confirmed this morning. Criminalization breeds isolation, and isolation in turn breeds vulnerability to violence, exploitation, and abuse. Instead of working to destigmatize prostitution and see sex workers as part of Canadian society, Bill C-36 will make it difficult and unsafe for sex workers to reach out to community services, to family and friends, or even to police for assistance. In fact, Section 213(1.1), which criminalizes communication, will give police considerable powers to continue to target and harass sex workers. Communications is one of the key means by which street-based sex workers are able to screen their client, to see if a client may be intoxicated or sober, to negotiate rates, services, and safer sex practices. Criminalizing the purchase of sex, as studies from Sweden have shown, will not protect sex workers, nor will it reduce demand. When clients are criminalized, they are also less likely to assist sex workers who may be exploited or abused, because those clients themselves will fear arrest. As well, criminalizing the purchase of sex, in effect, results in a de facto criminalization of the sale of sex. Working indoors has been demonstrated to enhance sex workers' ability to control their work conditions and to negotiate safer sex practices. Yet Bill C-36 impedes the ability to work indoors because it bans advertising and criminalizes the purchase of sexual services. Instead of criminalizing prostitution, the Government of Canada should listen to what sex workers have been saying for more than 30 years, and what sex worker groups the world over unanimously agree will increase the safety and security of sex workers, and that is decriminalization. Systems of decriminalization, such as the Prostitution Reform Act in New Zealand, allow sex workers to have the same labor protections and legal rights as any other person in the country. Studies of decriminalization in New Zealand have shown an improvement in working conditions, a decrease in violence, and an increase in the ability for sex workers to negotiate safer sex practices. There are already provisions in the criminal code pertaining to forced labor, forcible confinement, kidnapping, sexual assault, statutory rape, theft, and physical assault. Should sex work be decriminalized, none of these very important aspects of the criminal code will be affected. In fact, sex workers will have a greater ability to access and to charge people who may be doing these things to them. At Maggie's, we believe that Bill C-36 must be scrapped in its entirety. In its place, a system of decriminalization should be developed in order to provide sex workers with the same labor, legal, and human rights as any other person in Canada. We support the move from legislation that is moralist to one that is based on human rights and on health and safety standards. At Maggie's, we see the decriminalization of prostitution as an essential part of our overall harm reduction strategy. Thank you.
Ms. Forrester, are you adding anything or no?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
So my name is actually Chanel Gallant, and I'm a former staffer at Maggie's, the Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. I'm here representing one of our staffers, Monica Forrester, who could not be with us.
Okay.
Monica is an Indigenous sex working woman, and she was scheduled to be here, but over this past weekend, one of her close friends, who is also an Indigenous sex working woman, was arrested on communicating for the purposes of prostitution charges. Monica has to stay in Toronto to offer her friend support and bail. I believe that Monica was to be the one and only current Indigenous sex worker that this group will be hearing from. I invite you to correct me if I'm wrong on that. I am here in her stead to offer her submission because we do not want to allow the policing of prostitution to silence the very women that we need to be hearing from. So following this is the submission of Monica Forrester. My name is Monica Forrester, and I'm a woman of color from Curve Lake Reservation in Ontario. I'm a trans woman and a street sex worker of 25 years. I've been stigmatized because of my identity, my race, and my class. I'm here to speak about sex workers who are doing the work due to choice, coercion, or economic circumstance. For many years, I was homeless. I had no other options but to do sex work to survive and to get the basic necessities of life and access community. Sex work was where I found community with people dealing with the same discrimination as me. I'm now a college graduate and an outreach worker, bringing community empowerment and safety to marginalized groups. Many do not understand street sex work or how Bill C-36 will affect us. Some work the street because they are poor and don't have the money to pay for things like a phone or a computer or renting space. Some are homeless and have no other method of earning money. For some women, such as single mothers, social services is far from sufficient. Ontario Works provides $718 to a single parent in Ontario, but the average one-bedroom rent in Toronto is about $1,000 per month. Single parents who are sex working to support their family do not want to work at home where their children live, and so some choose to work on the street. Aboriginal women in remote areas are working along the highways in order to get from town to town. Survival sex work is necessary to feed their kids and themselves. They face added stigma within their communities because of ongoing colonization. Colonialism already silenced them about sex, and sex work adds another layer of stigma and more isolation from their community. Aboriginal women in Vancouver who were killed by Robert Pickton were from all over, but went to the downtown streets to do survival sex work. There are migrant people and newcomers to Canada whose first language isn't English. For them, advertising is difficult or even impossible, but they can advertise by being on the street and negotiating a few English words. Bill C-36 does not help these people, does not help sex workers, including those who have no other choices. For a lot of trans women like me, because they don't have basic human rights, they can't find jobs. Recently, a trans woman said to me about these new laws, "How am I going to pay my rent or go to college or transition so I can get another job?" This week, a 50-year-old woman who's been a sex worker for her entire adult life came into Maggie's for safer sex supplies and asked me, "Who's going to hire me? It's all I've ever done. Am I going to have to go on welfare now?" Bill C-36 will silence sex workers who experience violence. I'm a sex worker and a frontline outreach worker with 20 years' experience. I have seen all of these situations firsthand. What I see is that when there is more policing and surveillance, sex workers get isolated from people providing essential services, and that isolation leads to vulnerability. These services include education about safer sex, safer work areas, the law, policing, and community support. The street-based community is a community of its own. It can be close-knit. We educate each other because we need each other. Bill C-36 will change that because people will be more in fear of sharing information and supporting each other. We will have to take whatever clients we can and not be able to fully screen for safety. Police will push outdoor workers away from residential areas because of the restriction on being near anyone under 18. This will lead to an increase in residential surveillance and harassment. Marginalized groups like people of color, trans women, Aboriginal women, and Two-Spirit women are more likely to be street-faced, and they will face extreme criminalization under this bill. With the internet, much of the sex industry moved indoors. By criminalizing advertising, though, these workers will now be forced back out onto the street. This puts them at risk because indoor workers do not have any knowledge of street safety. Together, all of this will increase violence, murder, and HIV/AIDS against our community. My recommendations: that $20 million in exit funds should be used to offer direct support to sex workers that is not dependent on them leaving the industry, which many of us can't or don't want to do. We need laws that allow us to work with safety and dignity to make our own choices. For example, the right to advertise, to hire security staff, and to work with buddies. We need sex worker positive agencies like Maggie's that empower us about safety, health, and well-being. The Supreme Court decision should be respected because they saw the necessity of decriminalization for all sex workers, whether we are in it by choice, coercion, or because of economic circumstances. Right now, if we face violence, we can't call the police because it will be recorded in the system. I have never been able to call police for help, even after I was sexually assaulted. At the time, I had been through the mandatory diversion program after an arrest for prostitution, and knew that I faced incarceration if my sex work was discovered. So even though I was raped, I did not call police. Bill C-36 would not have helped me then, and it won't help me now. Reconsider Bill C-36 and the horrible outcomes it will have on the most marginalized sex workers in Canada. The fate of the sex worker community is in your hands. Thank you.
Thank you for that statement on behalf of Ms. Forrester. So that is the round of presentations. We go now to a round of questions, and our first question from the New Democratic Party is Madame Beauvin.
Merci.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for being here today. There is quite a variety of viewpoints. It was not easy for one side to hear what the other had to say, but it's the same situation for us. This is a very complex situation where we see groups that I consider to be feminists saying things very different from one feminist group to another. What fascinates me with this situation with prostitution is how it is almost all women who are invited, not only invited, but who want to come and talk about the situation, not always from the same point of view. I have a question for Ms. MacDonald. You listened to Madame Matt's speech and to Rose Sullivan from CLE.
He said, we believe in a world without prostitution. Do you believe in that?
No. Frankly, no, I don't believe in a world without prostitution. Not only that, but if this legislation, if the goal of this committee is to actually end prostitution, this legislation will not succeed in doing so.
Why is that?
It definitely would not be my choice to end prostitution, but if that is the committee's intent. That is because studies in Sweden showed that there was, and this is from the Swedish government, right, showed that the criminalization of clients did not, in fact, make a considerable difference in the amount of people doing sex work. What it did, though, is because of the harassment and targeting of sex workers on the street, and because of the clientele, difficulty and accessing clientele, a lot moved indoors, and a lot started working in massage parlors and more out of sight.
So no statistics because we don't see them. Are you a merchandise?
Sorry?
Because I heard it's prostitution equates as if women are merchandise. Sorry, maybe a bad translation, but anyway.
That's okay. No. I guess the question maybe that you're asking is when people say women are bought and sold or buying women's bodies. Frankly, that language is victimizing. Frankly, that language is dehumanizing, and it's also extremely sexist and problematic to talk about people in that manner as if we are objects, and we're not.
Thank you. Madame Matt, vous avez dit quelque chose en parlant.
Madame Matt, you said something when talking about the Bedford ruling. But the Supreme Court of Canada had made a ruling with a very narrow vision. You immediately drew a corollary between Bill C-36, saying that it rectified the situation somewhat. Did I correctly understand that for your organization, C-36 is doing what Bedford did not do? When it comes to changing the objectives of the law, they're doing what Bedford did not do and could not do in and of itself, which is to change the objectives of the law. Before the Supreme Court, the examination of the proof they had before them might have given different results. When it comes to security, I didn't have time to go into the details, but in Bill C-36, it would be worthwhile to go much further to be part of a definition. You wanted a definition of what sexual service was or what advertising was, but we need a definition of what security is. Security for us as feminists is not something that we can look strictly at from the point of view of giving a few seconds more to women to choose clients for whom it is impossible to know. If it were possible to know who the violent men are, we wouldn't have any shelters in Canada, and we wouldn't have sexual assault centers. Women cannot know, even with a few seconds more, even while living with them for years at a time. They cannot know at what time a man may become violent. When it comes to the issue of commodification, I'm a bit surprised by the way that you've minimized the arguments. No, I wasn't minimizing them. When we talk about prostitution, the groups who defend the Bedford ruling or decriminalization of prostitution entirely recognize that this is an industry like any other, a commercial transaction like any other. Whether or not the person considered themselves to be an object, it's up to them to decide. But it's clear that they place the discussion or the weight on the fact that this is a commercial exchange, and that's all. What we say is that it is not a commercial transaction. It is, above all, an unfair practice. I think I understand.
I find, thank God, there's something that everybody pretty much agrees, that 20 million is ridiculous. So I would like you, Minister, to maybe first tell me if after you sent your letter in February, did the minister contact you or anybody to view how the law should be drafted, other than just your position that Nordic model is it? Is there some consultation between Minister of Justice throughout this great country of ours, since you are pretty much the ones that will have to apply this new law with your police services and so on? And you talked about 20 million being divided over the period of 5 years, which gives a pretty much ridiculous amount for Manitoba. But what is needed, and what type of services are needed to do what everybody who believes in the Nordic model always put it with an equation? We need exit support. And exit support means what exactly?
Okay, there's some big questions. Yes, back in the fall at the ministers' meeting in Whitehorse, I advanced on behalf of Manitoba our view that the Nordic model was the way to go, and I did write to Minister MacKay early in February, and I know that MP Joy Smith and I had discussed it. I made sure every Manitoba MP got a copy of the letter. I haven't heard from Mr. McKay since the letter was sent early in February. In terms of the kinds of services that are needed to help sexually exploited victims leave behind their life, it is difficult because of the trauma that they've sustained. Attached to the submission is Tracia's Trust, which is kind of a summary of the various things that Manitoba is doing. There is no one simple answer. In many cases, it may be people who have physical trauma, very much like returning soldiers. In some cases, it's addictions problems, it's mental health issues. One of the things we found very helpful, which I think maybe we've understood a bit more about this afternoon, is how helpful it is to have experiential people who have the credibility of talking about what their life was about, who maybe have the best ability to work with people to try to affect that change. We have the Prostitution Diversion Program. That is only a 3-day program run by the Salvation Army. We intend to continue that program, whatever Bill C-36 looks like. That in and of itself does not work miracles. We are not going to get somebody who's been sexually exploited to magically, in the course of those 3 days, change their life. But if they can get into that camp, get cleaned up, eat properly, sleep, which oftentimes is not possible, and then at least have an opportunity to be lined up with various agencies that can help them to make that choice, then we're going to be further ahead. But it is not easy. I don't want to be flippant, but the amount of money Manitoba will get every year, if it goes per capita, may allow us to help one person or 2 people, and we know there's a greater demand than that. These are people who have suffered tremendously.
Thank you. Questions and answers. Our next question from the Conservative Party is Mrs. Smith.
Thank you to all the witnesses here today to give us your opinions. Mr. Swan, I applaud you for all the work that you do in Manitoba. I know with Bill C-36, I really applaud your support of that bill and your advice on some amendments, because for the first time in Canada, the purchase of sex will be illegal, and that'll help a lot of things. For first time, advertising by third parties will be addressed, and for the first time, we have compassion in the bill. Now, having said that, could you expand a little bit on what a victim actually needs? Because I know, living in the part of Winnipeg you live in and some of the streets that both of us have been on, perhaps you could give the committee an insight as to what really happens. I applaud Natasha and Rose for speaking today. It was fantastic. But could you give an overview as an elected person?
Sure. Well, it's true. I mean, I represent sort of the inner west end of Winnipeg, where there is street prostitution that takes place. I know there's other exploitation that takes place behind closed doors. Yeah. Obviously, the challenges are huge, and we've tried to get at some of the issues. If somebody comes forward who says, you know what, I've been out in the streets and I need help, if the first thing that we do is we take away their children, we're not actually getting anywhere. So family services can certainly use more assistance to help people, to come up with, helping them come up with a plan for how they can go and battle their addictions issue or their mental health issue, while still knowing they're not going to leave their children. One of the things traditionally that happened in Manitoba and elsewhere is that if you were out on the street and you were on social assistance, your social assistance worker would say, well, there you go, you've been out there, we're cutting off your social assistance. What do we think is going to happen when we take away the person's social assistance? Yeah. In many cases, it's housing. People don't have safe and affordable housing. In many cases, it is mental health services and addiction services. In many cases, it's moving people away from the situation they're in, which many times people want. It's not easy to do because you may be leaving behind.
But I know our time is going, so I just had another point to make. I have a couple more questions with the others, and thank you, because you know what stands out and what I've heard is the symbiotic relationship between provincial jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction partnership. Like, for the first time, the federal law, Bill C-36,
is working in partnership with what you're doing in the province of Manitoba, and I dare say it's one child at a time, isn't it? Or one victim at a time. But I also wanted to ask Jean McDonald, can you tell me, you're saying, you know, you're helping less risk to the prostitutes on the street. Can you tell me, do you get paid for this position? Or do you do it voluntarily? Or
Pardon me? What does my job have to do with the legislation that we are discussing today?
I'm just wondering if in helping the...
it's not...
You don't want to answer that question? That's fine.
I don't think it's pertinent to this discussion whatsoever.
Okay.
I am the executive director.
Right. I think you're taking offense. You mentioned that you're getting funding from the provincial government of Ontario.
That's
and
because
so I don't. She was asking you how much you get paid. She wanted to know if it was the organization, as we could ask her. Is it based on volunteers or employees?
How does whether I'm employed or a volunteer? I'm still not sure how. Well, maybe Joy could explain how my employment impacts this bill. No.
Well, it's just as the
it's
chair
okay.
said.
You don't want to answer the question. I just was explaining the question.
Yeah,
if you don't want to answer the question,
yeah. Obviously, we'll leave that. We can find that out. Madame Maté, I really liked what you were saying about the issue is the dignity of women, and Rose, you underlined that. So could either one of you voice what you think is so beneficial from Bill C-36? You've given some suggestion for amendments as well. But what you came today, Rose, and you said you fully support Bill C-36. What is it about Bill C-36 that would help those who need that help on the streets in a practical way?
The change of values that it may bring, the fact that it criminalizes men rather than criminalizing women. Helping women who have been victimized. I think that is a change in the mentality that should have occurred a long time ago, according to what I think when it comes to violence against women. It's also a matter of equality between women and men. I think that this bill is absolutely necessary. It's also to demonstrate that prostitution cannot be trivialized. It's not something that should be considered. In a country where we have all the means that we have, I don't believe that we should communicate the message to women that if they are poor, if they are in poverty, prostitution is an option. I think it would be better to say that there are other options available, and here they are. I just want to add that it's important to know that the other element that we agree with organizations like Maggie's is decriminalizing women in prostitution. C-36 could give the results it should give if we maintain some form of decriminalization of women in prostitution, be it on the street or indoors. I have the impression that if we leave the situation as is, the message is go indoors. You'll be safer there, depending on the position you have. The NDP seems to think that they'll be safer. But in real life, we know very well that regardless of the location, women can be victimized, can be victims of violence by clients, by pimps. It is in this spirit that we're trying to change the social perception of what prostitution is, and to allow women in prostitution to exit voluntarily. It's important to say that.
I know I have to rush through this. Natasha, could you please give us your opinion about, for the first time, targeting the Johns, to arrest the Johns? Do you think that's going to be beneficial to help keep the women safe?
Most certainly. In fact, I believe that Bill C-36 will actually give people who are being prostituted more leverage when dealing with violent Johns, to be able to call the police and not be feared, or not fear being blamed for the abuse that they're experiencing. I also believe that it gives them more opportunity to be able to screen, because they can do so without having to answer to pimps and Johns, because now men are going to be targeted. I also believe that by teaching society that this is an issue of male violence against mostly women and children, that we are going to teach future generations of boys to grow up and understand that this is something that they shouldn't contribute to. I also believe that focusing on support, or focusing on women and looking at them as victims in this industry, will actually provide more opportunities for them to exit, which we're not seeing right now. I think by pumping in money to organizations such as Maggie's, it actually enables people to stay there. And they did mention that there are some women that they believe can't get out, and I don't believe that is true at all. I think that anyone who wants something is able to make that a possibility. I am a living testimony.
Thank you for
in my
that.
last 2 years, I had drug-induced schizophrenia, and today I am in this position that I am today.
Thank you very much for those questions and answers. Our next questioner from the Liberal Party is Mr. Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first off, as a matter of courtesy to my colleagues on the committee and to the witnesses, I apologize for coming in late to the meeting. Mr. Deckert, Mr. Scott, and I were on Power and Politics in between sessions, and that was the reason that we were a bit late. Mr. Minister, I came in the middle of your statement, so I didn't get it all, but I did read it in advance. So we're now on the second panel of the day, and although there's been a great divergence of views through the day, there's one thing on which every single witness, except for Peter MacKay and the justice officials, agree on. Walk With Me Canada Victim Services, the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, the Criminal Lawyers Association, Professor Janine Benedette, Professor John Lohman, all agree, as did each of you in your testimony today, that the criminalization of sex workers under the communication provisions is problematic and should either be amended or completely wiped out. So that's one point of consensus from all of the witnesses except for the Minister and his officials today. I want to come first to Ms. Beasley and Madame Maté, because I know that both of your organizations have done an extensive survey of models in other countries. And we constantly hear around here about the Nordic model. And we know that the Nordic model is an approach that criminalizes the purchasers. But what we have before us is something that not only criminalizes the purchasers, but in many instances also criminalizes the providers, and that criminalizes advertising. Now, a witness that we're going to be hearing from later on in the week is a fellow by the name of Jose Mendez Bota, and he was the rapporteur at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. He also did an extensive survey of the different models around the world. And in his report, he describes a prohibitionist system which bans prostitution by criminalizing all aspects of it, including the sale of sex and all the people involved. And he said a number of European countries have chosen this approach, including Albania, Croatia, Romania, the Russian Federation, Serbia, and Ukraine. So my question for you, Ms. Beasley, and for you, Ms. Maté, given all of the things that have been piled on top of the basic Nordic model in Bill C-36, are we not, in fact, much closer to a prohibitionist model with what we have before us?
We are a hybrid, I would say. we're not fully prohibitionist. I don't think it's fair to say that, because there is an awful lot in the bill that recognizes, the status of most persons in prostitution. There is as I said, the overall spirit and intent of the legislation is that those who are prostituted not be criminalized. There is, however, this nod to sort of a prohibitionist approach, which still allows. So the first two sections of the communications original provision weren't challenged, so they stand. Yep. And then there's this new section that's been added, dealing with public places where minors might be present. And you've heard each of us on that and how we would like to see it narrowed, removed, amended, those sorts of things. So we all share that concern. But I don't think it's fair to say that this approach has, gone fully prohibitionist. It's kind of a hybrid. I would say it has a nod to prohibitionist approach.
So the Canadian law is somewhere between Sweden and Russia?
I wouldn't say Russia. No. I don't think that's...
Okay. Madame Maté?
I would say it's not a prohibitionist approach at all. And we surely count on every political party around the table to get rid of what we want to get rid. Yeah. If I can put an image, for us, it's like we have the right map to go where we want to go. We know where we're going to go. We have the right map, but we have a little rock in our shoe. And that little rock in the shoe is the criminalization of women, particularly in the streets. So we have to make sure that we keep on the track we're on, but get rid of what is not working. And I think that it is unfair to use the prohibitionist jargon when we talk about what we have in front of us. We can say that the prohibitionist approach has not been successful at all, and there's not only Russia that we can think about. There's many countries around the world who actually criminalize only women in prostitution and not men. I don't know how you would call that, but for me, this is like the summum of what patriarchy can do is criminalize women for being actually sexually exploited. So for me, we have to be careful about how we use the words. The prohibitionist legal model, because that's mostly what we're talking about, would be a model that says in its objectives and it's in practice that all parties involved in prostitution should be criminalized. And this is not what this bill is saying. So we just have to get rid of that rock that we have in our socks, in our shoe. But don't lose the map.
Ms. Fall and Ms. Sullivan, both of you have described being in the sex trade and successfully exiting. Si j'ai bien compris votre témoignage.
If I correctly understood your testimony.
Either of you been saddled with either a youth criminal justice record or a criminal record as a result of your time in the sex trade?
Yes. The first time that I had ever stood on a street corner, I was arrested at 17 years old by a police officer. Yes.
So that was a youth record. Describe the difficulty that the youth record caused you in your exit.
Yes, certainly. It wasn't just the youth record; it was also my adult record with soliciting that also hindered me to, be able to do what other people are able to do with reintegration into society. When I was arrested, I basically just gave up. I thought, this is it. I have a criminal record for prostitution. There's nothing else out there for me. I might as well just accept this environment. And what I did was I made the best of that environment, albeit abusive. I needed to embrace it for my own survival.
Madame Sullivan?
J'ai pas de casier judiciaire.
I don't have a criminal record. I was very, very lucky.
You indicated that the money that's been put on the table, if a per capita formula is used, isn't going to make a whole lot of difference in Manitoba. We don't much care for per capita funding in my part of the world, believe me. But I guess I'll ask a couple of questions in that regard. The first is, given that you put $8 million a year, is that right?
That's right.
Into these programs now, what is the right number to make a meaningful difference? And if I may, because I know I'm just about done here, all too often we see criminal justice measures introduced in this place that have significant impacts on the budgets of those who have to administer the justice, your departments, the provinces. Do you have any concerns in that regard with respect to this legislation?
Well, with respect to the legislation, no, since we called for the Nordic model to come to Canada. So we accept that there could be some additional costs. To some extent, we think we can manage that. It'll be our intention to continue running what we call John School. It's operated by the Salvation Army. We think with some minimum fines that will allow us to raise the amount that people will pay for John School so they don't have to go down to court and maybe have a reporter or their neighbor hanging around the corner. It would be my hope that with that money from John School, we'll be able to expand the prostitution diversion camp and provide, again, that first window into changing people's lives. Overall, the $8 million a year, I can tell you right now, is not enough. There is not enough support that we can provide to assist people. And of course, many times it's co-occurring mental health and addictions issues. It's dealing with trauma. It's dealing with many complex issues. At $8 million a year, we're struggling to provide a modicum of services. So certainly we look forward to something more than a temporary small investment from the federal government. We'd like it to be more substantial. We'll continue to shoulder the majority of the burden, and we accept that's the case. We think this is important in Manitoba.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions and answers. Our next questioner from the Conservative Party is Mr. Decker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses. I just want to say to Ms. Sullivan, Ms. Fowl, and through you, Ms. Gallant, to Monica Forster, that I think you're very brave for coming here and telling us your stories, and I want to thank you for doing that. I think it's very difficult for us as legislators to really understand what takes place in an industry like this without hearing your stories. So thank you for that. I want to just respond quickly to Ms. Sullivan. You were concerned that that Bill C-36 would criminalize a sex worker where she was carrying on the practice in her home where her children would be present, and the answer is simple. That's not a public place, so it wouldn't be caught under that provision. So I just wanted to reassure you on that. To Ms. Forster through Ms. Gallant, she said that she asked to be corrected if she was wrong, that we weren't hearing from any other Indigenous people in the sex business, and that
workers.
Well, we did hear from one previously, as you know, and we will be hearing from the Native Women's Association of Canada later in the week, and I understand that they, for example, believe in the criminalization of the purchase of sex in the Nordic model. So
I understand they do, and I do not believe that any of their witnesses will be current Indigenous sex workers.
Okay, but there are former sex workers.
That's right,
okay.
and that's why I'm making the point of talking about people who are currently be impacted by the legislation. Former workers will not be.
Okay, well, we'll hear from what they have to say about what they think the impact will be. The other thing that was mentioned by Ms. McDonald was that this bans all forms of advertising. That's just not true. There is advertising provision for advertising done in a way by the individual, him or herself, that would allow them to do it in a way without exploitation. And you mentioned something that I thought was curious. You said that you believe that sex worker groups the world over are unanimously favored decriminalization. But we hear from the organization that Ms. Sullivan and Ms. Maté represent. We heard from Ms. Fowl. We've heard from a number of other organizations, and we'll hear from other organizations that are both women's groups and groups that represent sex workers that do favor the criminalization of the purchase of sex, the so-called Nordic model. So I don't understand.
Well, what I would
say
to that, I'd go back to what Chanel was just saying, and that is that the sex worker groups that I'm talking about are predominantly, if not fully, made up of people who are currently in the sex industry. There's a big difference between someone who will actually themselves be impacted by this legislation, a huge difference.
But but you will agree with me that there are organizations which represent sex workers. That
No.
So you're saying there are no in nowhere in the world, Canada or any else
Not- well,
any
I-
other place in the world, there are no organizations which represent current sex workers who believe in the
Yes,
Nordic model.
current. There are no.
We do.
Can I
Oh, are
can I
you
hear from
current
Ms.
sex
Matte?
workers?
But some of our advocates are. You just have to go onto our website to look at that.
I find that hard to believe.
Well, there seems to be some disagreement on that point. And there was
Mr.
one other
Becker,
point.
could you focus your questions so we have questions and one person answers?
Sure. So, folks, just one more thing from Ms. McDonald. In answer to a question from Madame Boivin about the elimination of prostitution, you said, first of all, you didn't think that was possible. And then I thought it was kind of curious. Maybe I got it wrong, but I thought you said that that wouldn't be something that you supported, the elimination of prostitution if it were available. That wouldn't be something that you supported. Is that what you said?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay,
For
so-
myself, it is not something that I would like to see happen.
You
I
don't-
would prefer prostitution be decriminalized.
But do you,
because
you don't want to see it eliminated. Is my point? Is that correct? I just want to understand that point. Is that you wouldn't want to see prostitution ended?
The Prostitution Reform Act of New Zealand was recognizing the harm done to sex workers, and that is why they decided to decriminalize. In fact, the legislation, the intent of that legislation was to create a framework to safeguard the human rights of sex workers and to protect them from exploitation, to promote the welfare and occupational health and safety of sex workers.
The point that I just
These are
wanted to
things that
understand-
sex
Excuse
workers
me,
need.
Dawn, if I might. I'm trying to ask you a question. Is that you see merit in the continuation of prostitution in Canada?
I see
Can you just
merit
answer that,
in.
yes or no?
No, actually, I can answer how I want it to do that, sir. Actually, yes. Prostitution, when it is between two or more consenting adults, I feel that those consenting adults should have the ability to decide for themselves what they want to be doing.
Okay, I take your point. Mr. Swan, I want to thank you for being here. I think it's important that you're here as a provincial attorney general. You're one of the individuals that are going to have to make this new legislation work if and when it's passed and becomes law. You mentioned in your opening statement that you believe that most sex workers are exploited. Is that correct? And that you feel that criminalizing the purchase of sex will reduce the exploitation of the people. And did I get that correct?
That's right.
Okay. So my friends in the NDP will correct me if I'm wrong, in the federal NDP, but they seem to be saying, I heard Mr. Scott say this to the CBC earlier today, that they do not believe in the criminalization of the purchase of sex, and they oppose it because they believe it will actually make the carrying on. Okay, well, you'll have a chance.
You're sitting right beside me, and I have a witness who said I didn't say that.
You're wrong. All right. So maybe they do. Perhaps they'll clarify. Maybe they do. If I got it wrong, I apologize. I believe I heard them say that they oppose Bill C-36 because they believe that the criminalizing of the purchase of sex will actually make the carrying on of the practice of the sex industry more dangerous. Do you believe that? Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I think, let me just talk a little bit about our current practice in Manitoba. If you're a buyer of sex and you get picked up by the police and you're charged with the current provisions of the criminal code, you have two options. You can go and follow the criminal option. You can show up in court, in which case you may get a very small fine. You may get an absolute discharge, but you're going down to court in front of, well, it's an open court. Or you can go to the John School, run by the Salvation Army, in which case men can learn about the real dynamics of what this is all about. Mm-hmm. And they will hear from not just the police and not just health workers, they will hear from experiential people who will tell them what their lives have been like. We also had a little additional feature where if you're a John in Manitoba who gets caught, you get to go and clean up back lanes in my neighborhood. And you can see what it's like when there's condoms and syringes laying around. I would actually like to continue having John School. We may have a wider pool of people taking that program. That is a restorative justice practice. That is a way to educate people, and I hope we never see somebody again in the justice system. We think that if men actually understand the dynamics of prostitution, the great majority of men will change their attitudes, and I do believe we can change behavior.
So you believe it can be reduced?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
For those questions and answers, now we go to Mr. Scott of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could ask a couple of questions of Ms. McDonald and Ms. Gallant from Maggie's. I think it was prompting some of the questions from Mr. Deckert, who doesn't seem to be able to get his mind around the perspective of at least a substantial percentage of current sex workers. And you said in your presentation, the service users of Maggie's unanimously reject this bill. And you talked about consultations and that. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a bit more, because I think we are facing a fair degree of ships passing in the night. People not fully understanding how it could ever be that the sex workers that you work with and for would have that point of view. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more.
Absolutely. Like I said, we work with many street-involved sex workers. We have a drop-in where people can come in and get some food, pick up safer sex and safer drug use supplies. And people were wondering what's going on with this legislation, and we thought, you know, what's a great idea is to have an education workshop explaining what this legislation is about, and we told them we're going to be coming here as witnesses, and we want to hear from you guys. What do you think? How do you think that this will impact you in your everyday life as current street-based sex workers? And they were very, very worried. They did not see that this would protect them whatsoever, because when you're criminalized, you can, it's very, very difficult to access police services. Like Monica said in her testimony, because she was criminalized, she was unable, or she felt unable to contact police when she was quite brutally sexually assaulted. And so when I'm suggesting decriminalization as an alternative, what I want to say is I'm looking at prostitution pragmatically, okay? I'm saying this is existing in our world today. It's been existing for many thousands of years, if not more. It's not going to just end immediately, and that's certainly the example that we see in Sweden, where this so-called Nordic model comes from. And the approach I take to prostitution is pragmatic, not based on a moral kind of grounds where, ooh, icky, I don't like that. No, this happens, and yeah, it sucks for some people, but what are the best ways to reach out to those people and to help them? And I was saying what the Prostitution Reform Act of New Zealand, what its purpose was. And part of that legislation built into it that they would do a review after 3 to 5 years. And after 5 years, a study conducted by the Department of Public Health in New Zealand found that, on the whole, the PRA has been effective in achieving its purpose. They found that the sex industry had not increased in size, and many of the social evils predicted by some who opposed decriminalization had not actually come to be.
If I could just add to that a little bit, Craig, I wanted to put on the record, because we're hearing a lot about this 20 million going into various kinds of John schools and diversion programs, et cetera, just to reiterate the testimony of Monica Forrester, who was raped while she was on a diversion program and could not access police support. What we're talking about here is a system that still continues to criminalize sex workers. You cannot criminalize the purchase of sex without criminalizing the sale of sex. We've had a number of comments saying that advertising would be protected. That's not what we're hearing from Pivot Legal and from HIV Legal AIDS Network, who have pointed out that this legislation criminalizes any third party that advertises sex worker services. So I fail to see how you can advertise without a third party. And so that's for indoor workers, but outdoor workers are still telling us, I could not call the police in this situation. The police will not be a support service to me as someone who faces, and we're talking about sex workers like Monica and others who are facing some of the greatest vulnerability, and they're telling us that these programs will not protect them from violence and sexual harm and HIV and AIDS, and in fact will have the opposite impact. And I would like to say that, this bill will cause harm. This bill will lead to beaten, raped, and murdered sex workers, and increase in HIV and AIDS, and we'll be back when that happens. Because we will consider this Parliament partially responsible for those outcomes on the sex worker community.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one last point. I only have 30 seconds, and if anybody, maybe Minister Swan could comment. One of the central things about the Nordic model is the, let's call it the social democratic policy environment within which it's situated. Equal life chances are much more emphasized in a country like Sweden, so the supply end is handled more at that stage. Access to services that help at the exit end. And I would add, although it's not so much clear in Sweden, if you're looking at New Zealand, you're looking at kind of the middle where the safety, health, and labor protections are put in. And I'm just wondering if you could just reiterate for everybody that $20 million is nowhere going to come nowhere close to dealing with, let's call it, the social democratic policy environment that's needed.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Our next question is from the Conservative Party, Ms. Ambler.
And thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. We appreciate your time and your testimony very much. My question, when I told friends and family and constituents that I was coming here this week to sit on this committee about this new legislation, a couple of people, not very many, but a handful, said their comment was, you're not going to change. You're not going to stop prostitution. It's been around forever. Is it the oldest or second oldest profession? Whatever the saying is. Oh, you're the second. All right, oldest profession. And so I'm heartened by the testimony and the beliefs that there are organizations and people who work in this, who work with prostitutes and in this world, who do believe that it is possible to build a world without prostitution, and that should be our goal. And so I guess I want to ask the women who have lived this, do you, Natasha and Rose, do you think that this should be the goal of legislation, to eradicate, and if not fully eradicate, at least substantially reduce the amount of prostitution in this country?
Yeah, certainly. We should aim to end all forms of violence in this country, and prostitution is just another form of violence. We have child abuse, we have domestic violence, we have all these different various forms of violence, and we don't just succumb, we don't just accept these and find legislation that can help make it easier for them to be less abused. We aim to end, our laws are designed to end these forms of abuse and reduce these forms of violence. And so do I believe that abuse is ever going to go away? Maybe not, but we don't give up. We don't give up for the people who are being harmed by it.
Thank you. Ms. McDonald, I can see you shaking your head, so I have a feeling it's because you don't think that you don't see prostitution as abuse. I'm wondering, and I want to thank you for what you do, and that I understand that you want to reduce the harm, and that that you want to help. My question for you, and I know that you consider this pragmatic and you look at it in that way, and I appreciate that. I'd like to ask you though, in addition to counseling women in the sex trade on how to do it more safely and how to protect themselves, do you also counsel them to get out eventually? Is that your end goal as well?
It is not my end goal. Exit is not my end goal. I do actually support people who come to me and say, I want to start looking for another job. We're actually planning to have a workshop about how to write a resume, how to do a cover letter. We offer our clients a space where they can use our computers and printing out of those kind of things. But the thing is, people know that when they come to Maggie's, that they're not going to be judged. Okay. They're not going to be told that they're bad or that they should want to leave. They're not going to be told, such as the woman from Walk With Me earlier said, that they can build their healing journey in jail. Like, what was that even?
No one is suggesting that, and there are no provisions in this bill to put prostitution in jail.
Yes, there are.
There aren't. We're talking about summary convictions, which do not lead to criminal records of any kind.
And what if they're working with? What if they're working in the area of young 18 or younger?
May I ask you how you got out?
It's been my experience that most of us had to hit a rock bottom to get out, which means near-death experiences, mental health issues, being institutionalized, and sometimes jail actually gives us the opportunity to have that time to be able to think about our life circumstances. Obviously jail is not an exit program, as might have been implied by others, Yeah, I managed to get out because I went 12 years in the sex trade industry. I was forced, and I also sold independently. I have sold sex in illegal establishments and legal establishments. And I went 10 of those 12 years never using hard drugs. In fact, I was very discriminative against people who did use drugs. And the trauma caught up with me. I'd been sexually assaulted by a driver for escorts. The escort drivers that were driving me from A to B were coke dealers. It was easily accessible, and a trauma incident had happened, and I didn't know how to cope, and I did turn to cocaine. And I spent 2 years on cocaine, and I developed a drug-induced schizophrenia, and that was a pretty scary experience for me.
Thank you.
Questioners from the New Democratic Party, Madame Clay.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. This is a very interesting discussion. And I'd like to repeat what I said earlier when I was speaking to the previous panel. I think it's important to point out here who's right and who is wrong, which lawyer is right, which lawyer is wrong. I think what we're doing is we're respecting the spirit of a ruling, and we have to figure out what the best legislation is that we should pass in order to protect the security and the health of women and men who are involved in prostitution. Now, I've been listening to the testimony, and I think there is agreement that there is a problem with the advertising provisions. The approach that the government is trying to take is to criminalize the client and not the prostitutes themselves. And I think that there is a consensus here that the problem lies on that prohibiting advertising in public places. So I would like to hear Ms. MacDonald on that problem within the bill. And if the purpose here is to only criminalize the Johns, then what does this prohibition of advertising do? Because, in fact, you end up criminalizing these sex workers.
that are actually sex workers who do advertise online in newspapers, and they're concerned with this legislation that it will be difficult for them to reach clients because many of them use third-party websites. I won't mention their names. I was going to, but and so they're very concerned about that. The other thing they're concerned about is that many workers will work with buddies or do duos, basically is the name for it, and they're worried that if they list their friends on their website, that they could be criminalized for that. The other issue, and it's my understanding that and maybe you can correct me if it's a wrong reading, but that even if your advertisements are put up by yourself, you aren't criminally responsible, but that they can actually be forcibly taken down by the courts. And that also basically bans advertising.
Mais est-ce que je voudrais juste rapidement avoir une réponse.
So I'd just like to have a brief answer from the other witnesses as well. For example, Ms. Fowl, do you agree that prohibiting advertising will end up criminalizing sex workers? Do you agree with that?
Clearly highlights that the people who sell sex are victims of this industry. I don't see their point.
No, I mean, they have an interdiction. I don't know, sorry, I'm not very good in English. So they have an interdiction of publicity in a public, so they are criminalized if they do advertise for themselves in a public area.
I thought Mrs. Smith already addressed that.
Okay, so you don't agree. Thank you. And sorry, because I don't have a lot of time, and I would like to talk about the $20 million to Mr. Swan. And I think it's very important that instead of implementing a bill that would actually target the consequences of a situation, why not try to target the problematic at its source, and saying that there are social factors that unfortunately make some people be more vulnerable than others. So why not try and implement something, and I mean financial programs or whatever, to target the problematic at its source. So we're talking about reducing poverty, and if we're talking about achieving equality between men and women, then why not target poverty, where we know that unfortunately women usually live in a state of poverty greater than men's. So can you elaborate on that?
Sure, and I mean, one of the reasons I'm here as a Manitoban is that, of course, we have the tragedy of missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Now, just so it's clear, not every Aboriginal woman who goes missing or is murdered has been sexually exploited. But if you are an Aboriginal woman who is being sexually exploited, your odds are not good. And we know from the work that's been done, I know that Joy Smith and Irene Matheson and others were on a committee that looked at human trafficking several years ago, and many of the recommendations include ways to deal with poverty, to deal with education in First Nations, where many of the young people are being trafficked from. You're absolutely right that there is much to be done on poverty, on housing, on educational opportunities. That doesn't change the fact that I believe that with the amendments I've asked for, Bill C-36 is a great way further downstream to try and prevent loss and damage and more tragedies. But you're right, there's many big questions to be answered.
Okay, thank you for those questions and answers. And our final questioner for this afternoon is Monsieur Gauguin. We'll go a couple of minutes past because we started a couple of minutes late.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. My question is directed to Minister Swan. Minister Swan, obviously Manitoba appears in its enforcement of adopted the Nordic model. And in the Nordic model, of course, the prostitutes are not charged, correct? You had concerns with Section 15, of course, which the prostitutes would be charged if they're selling their goods in a public place. And, of course, the intent in that provision is to not expose children to what prostitution can be. Now, we all know that when a prosecution is undertaken, it's gone a couple of steps. Basically, the police have enforced their discretion, the Crown has enforced its discretion, and we know from discussions with other police forces that prior to Bedford, what the police forces would do is they would actually arrest the prostitutes because they'd have a legal authority to do so, would question them, and would inquire as to whether or not they were victimized, whether there was some way that they could get information about the pimps, those who were victimizing them, and then would not charge them, but would then direct them to services which might extract them from the industry. So if you're not charging the prostitutes, you're sort of taking away that possibility, although ultimately they're not charged. I guess my question is if this bill was amended to require the Attorney General to consent to the charges going forward, would that change your point of view?
Look, I mean, if somebody is being picked up for communicating, or whatever the new section is going to be called, I mean, then you do have the sort of Damocles hanging over your head. Are the police going to lay a charge if you don't give up information on somebody or something else? And I don't think that's a helpful way to deal with the issue. Again, in Manitoba, not just our Crown attorneys, but also the Winnipeg Police Service and our other police services are very reluctant to lay charges in any circumstances because they recognize the difference between sellers of sex and buyers of sex. I mean, I look at the Bedford decision, and in my letter to Minister MacKay, I had quoted from the Chief Justice's comments, who said, as the application judge found, street prostitutes, with some exceptions, are a particularly marginalized population, whether because of financial desperation, drug addictions, mental illness, or compulsion from pimps. They often have little choice but to sell their bodies for money. Realistically, while they may retain some minimal power of choice, what the Attorney General of Canada called constrained choice, these are not people who can be said to be truly choosing a risky line of business. With those comments of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, if we don't amend this bill to remove those provisions, this is going to be a red flag for a challenge to this bill. And I don't know if it'll be successful or not. I think the Chief Justice, speaking for the court, has been pretty blunt about that. We think there are better ways to assist victims of sexual exploitation than to have the threat of criminal prosecution hanging over their head. And again, I do represent an area where, unfortunately, people see street prostitution. I can tell you from speaking with my constituents, taking off my Attorney General hat and putting on my hat as the member of the legislature from Minto, the great majority of people in my area, I'm quite satisfied in saying understand the need for a differential response, that the old law did not make sense. The provisions that were struck down in the Bedford case have some challenges. This is our chance to get it right. And I don't think we do that by continuing to criminalize people who are the most vulnerable.
But there's more than anecdotal evidence that the prostitutes who do exercise their profession in public places are the most vulnerable, the most inclined to be victimized, letting alone the extraction of information, as you might have said. What about the possibility of taking them into your confidence, of finding out a little bit more about them, about introducing them to a social worker, introducing them to a victims group, and somehow opening the door of getting help from them? Because, you know, you can't help those who don't want to help themselves, and if there's no legal authority to apprehend them and to somehow incite them to get the help, where do you go?
Well, look, the prostitution diversion program continues to run in Manitoba, even though there are very few charges being laid and very few threats of charges being made. It is our intention that even if Bill 36 passes as amended, we will continue to run that program, and we will be able to find victims of sexual exploitation who want to take that program. And again, it's 3 days right now, which is barely enough time for somebody who's been working in the streets in the north end or the west end of Winnipeg just to get themselves to that window of being able to see maybe there's something more. I would love to expand that program, both in terms of the number of days, how often we offer that, and perhaps some more meaningful assistance up front to assist people in making that change. I wouldn't quite phrase it, you can't help people who don't want to help themselves, but what I've learned from organizations like Sage House, Salvation Army, and TURF in Winnipeg is that the best we can do is to provide a platform and a safe place for people to start to make that decision to change their lives.
Hey, well, thank you very much for those questions and answers. I want to thank the panelists for being here today. It was a very interesting panel, and I appreciate all your responses. We will be continuing to study this for the next 3 days until this time on Thursday, so stay tuned. We are televised, and we're always open for visitors. Thank you very much, and with that, we will call it till tomorrow morning.